Dr. Timothy Ball is a renowned environmental consultant and former climatology professor at the University of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Dr. Ball is also Chief Science Advisor of the International Climate Science Coalition and a policy advisor to the Heartland Institute. With a doctorate in climatology from the University of London, Queen Mary College, England, Dr. Ball's comprehensive background in the field includes a strong focus on the reconstruction of past climates and the impact of climate change on human history and the human condition. Dr. Ball is a leader in the current global warming debate and appears regularly as a guest on radio and television. Timothy Ball is also known for suing the creator of the hockey stick, Michael Mann. In 1998, Mann and co-authors Raymond Bradley and Malcolm Hughes published in Nature their seminal paper, Global Scale Temperature Patterns and Climate Forcing Over the Past 6 Centuries. The graph showed world temperatures essentially flat or slightly declining for 900 plus years, the shaft of the hockey stick, and then shooting up dramatically during the 20th century era of human carbon dioxide emissions, the blade of the stick. Dr. Tim Ball from Canada had stated that Mann belongs to the state Penn, not Penn State. In other words, Dr. Ball openly accused Mann of deliberate fraud in creating the hockey stick graph. The lawsuit filed in 2011 lasted until 2019, when the Canadian court finally, after 8 long and expensive years of litigation, finally threw it out. Dr. Ball's defense was simple. I told the truth. I can prove Mann is a fraudster if he will show me his supporting math. Mann refused to produce it, claiming it was proprietary information. Mann et al. Had truncated inconvenient data that failed to match the narrative they wanted to present. Most would call this kind of data truncation a clear-cut instance of scientific fraud. Real science requires open access to data, so that skeptical scientists can see if the initial results are reproducible. When scientists hide their data, they aren't doing science, they're doing something else. In this case, that something else looks a lot like propaganda.
Today we have Mr. Timothy Ball. He's a former professor at the University of Winnipeg in Canada. Climatologist, and we would like to talk about climate change and CO2 factor and the rest of what you can tell us about today.
Well, the answer is, of course, that climate's changing. It always has and it always will. And the current changes are well within long-term natural variability of climate. But unfortunately, I won't talk about the politics, but you really can't leave the politics out of it. Because what's happened is they've used global warming and climate change for a political agenda. So having said that, the current situation, as I said, is well within long-term natural variability. And just to illustrate the point, and I've been in this game for over 40 years, when I started studying climate specifically, prior to that I spent 4 years in anti-submarine in the North Atlantic, 5 years in the Arctic, and what I got from that experience was that weather forecasting was terrible. And I wanted to find out why they couldn't do good weather forecasting. And it amuses, when I talk to farmers, for example, it amuses them that they can't tell them what the weather's going to be like 5 days from now, but they're very certain about what it's going to be like 50 years from now. Okay. And there's this disconnect. And so when I started out, from my experience of bad weather forecasting, I decided to go back to university and try and figure out why forecasting was so bad. What I learned very quickly through Professor Hubert Lamb at East Anglia University was that when you look at the long-term historical record, it's amazing how much the climate changes all the time naturally. And that's where the problem is. People don't know the long-term historical record and the degree to which it changes. And one of the things they can get away with is say, oh, changes are more rapid than ever before. It's simply not true. And as I said, just to illustrate, when I actually went back to university, global cooling was the consensus. From 1940 to 1970, the temperature of the world was going down, and everybody was saying, oh, and CIA were doing studies of the impact on world food production and how that was going to cause social unrest and so on. And then starting about 1980, the world temperature started to go up. And then, of course, I call it the trend wagon. They were on the trend wagon going down. Oh, it's going to keep on going down. It's the end of the world. Oh, no, it's going up. Oh, it's going to keep on going up. It's the end of the world. The reality is that the real debate that doesn't get out there in the public is that there are two schools here. And there was a conference in Warsaw back in 1990. And what you had was the Eastern countries, such as Russia and China and Ukraine and others, they were saying that the climate is cyclical. And I've been working with the Russian climatologist Borisenkov, who worked on the Russian chronicles of 1,000 years. And of course, when you look at that long-term record, you see the cycles of climate. The West, America and Britain, they were into chaos theory. They said, oh no, it's all chaotic, you can't predict it. And so chaos theory was dominant. That's still the case today. You still see the argument going on. I'm totally with the climate cycle people. And I remember at a conference in Bologna in Italy, and I was so proud that I could get up and say, well, it rained on such and such a day in Churchill, Manitoba, Canada in 1742. And the Chinese guy got up and said, well, it was raining in 348 BC. Okay, you win. So the Russians and the Chinese have these long-term historic records. And that's the only way that you can start to understand what the pattern is.
Wonderful. It's very interesting that you talk about cyclicity. Would you speak a little more about it? What do you know about it?
Well, the cycles are well, first of all, let's establish something very important. The whole world believes that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, studies all of climate change. It doesn't. And this gets back into the political part of it. They wanted then to identify that CO2 was a problem. And we don't need to go into the reasons for that. They wanted to isolate CO2. One of the things that you learn after you study government for a while is, especially in the West, is that people think, oh, there's a problem and we need to get the politics out of it, as you're doing here, and so we'll appoint a commission of inquiry. And everybody says, oh, that's great. What you find out after you've been involved in these commissions of inquiry is that the politicians and the bureaucrats go back and set the terms of the inquiry. They limit what the inquiry could look at and predetermine the results. Most people don't know that they were given the definition of climate change as only looking at human causes of climate change. And you can read that in Article 1 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You can't determine how much effect humans are having if you don't know how much the climate is changing naturally. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but the human portion of it is so small, you couldn't separate it out anyway. And this is the problem. And so, and just to illustrate that point, for example, the IPCC, who, by the way, produced the numbers on how much CO2 is produced by humans every year, so that's very incestuous and dangerous in science. They're producing their own numbers. But they come up with a figure of so many gigatons each year. Every year, that human production of CO2 is within the error factor of two natural sources of CO2. So for example, the oceans, we only know the amount of CO2 going in and out of the oceans by a factor of, 10 gigatons. Well, that equals the total amount that humans produce a year. And then when you look at rotting vegetation, the same thing. So two natural sources of CO2 have an error factor in our knowledge of them that is equal to the human production of CO2. So it's simply impossible to isolate the human portion of it. But that was what they did. And by the way, just to illustrate this point, and this is sort of outside of the politics of it, and it's the danger for science and the use of science for a political agenda. That's why you've got the problem that you've got. And of course, what did they do? They then produced computer models that identified CO2 as the cause of climate change. And what did they say? They assumed that CO2 increases, the temperature will increase. And when you ask them, say, well, how do you know that? As I did at several meetings, they say, well, in our computer models, if we increase CO2, the temperature goes up. Well, of course it does. You programmed it to do that. Okay. And so it's a self-serving, self-feeding system that perpetuates itself. And it's got nothing to do with science at all.
Okay, can we go back to actual science? Now we know we shouldn't trust IPCC, we agree with you 100%. Now what is really going on?
It's a very important point to know with all of this. In the old days, like my early days in university, what happened was the old professors had the old ideas and the prevailing wisdoms, and the new young professors came in and challenged that. And that was very healthy. That's what science was all about. Now, it's the new young professors come in totally indoctrinated out of the school system, and it's the old professors like myself and Fred Singer and Will Happer that are saying, hey, hang on a minute, this is very bad science. So Happer was appointed by Trump to head a climate security group, and what they're doing is they're saying, look, we're going to look at all the things that the IPCC didn't look at. And so we'll start to see some balance on the world stage. Of course, they're attacking Happer, saying, oh, he's paid by the oil companies, and he's this, and he's that, and all the rest of it. But that's what they do. I mean, if they don't like the science that you're presenting, they go to the personal attacks, and so the science gets pushed aside. So I do think we're going to see a change with more and better information getting out to the public. The other thing that's very interesting about this is all of the surveys show that the public are simply not buying into this. I mean, there was a UN survey done about a year ago, 10 million people in 8 different countries, and they asked them to list or to identify their major socioeconomic concerns, and they put climate change dead last. It was 16th on a list of 16. Mm-hmm. The public don't think it's a concern at all. And yet, of course, for the politicians, it's a beautiful vehicle to say, oh, the sky is falling, you need me to save you, and I'll hold the sky up for you. That's what's going on. But they also, in America, there are the Pew Center polls where they ask Americans what their concerns are, and they list 32 of them. Climate change and global warming are 32nd on the list. So it's not a concern for the public.
How do you think, what is the main reason of cyclicity climate changes? And what is period of this cyclicity?
Well, the main reason is the sun. It's pure and simple. And it probably explains at least 95% of climate change. When you do the long-term pattern, and the dominant cycles, of course, are what they call the Milankovitch cycle, which named after a Yugoslavian mathematician who calculated by the work that he did without computers is unbelievable. But he calculated the change in energy that comes from the sun over 400,000 years with a changing tilt, changing orbit, and changing precession of the equinox. That gives you a 19,000 year cycle, a 40,000 year cycle, and a 100,000 year cycle. And those absolutely dominate the long-term temperature pattern. But the other side of it is the greenhouse effect. Water vapor is 95% of the greenhouse effect. And they don't look at, the IPCC don't look at that. They focus on CO2, which are only 4% of the greenhouse gases. Now, how do they do that? Well, they say, well, yes, humans put water vapor into the atmosphere, but the amount we put up is so small relative to the total amount that's there, it's not of no consequence. But the problem with that is we don't know how much water vapor there is in the atmosphere or how it changes over time. And you've only got to change water vapor by 2% and it equals all of the CO2 effect. But this is what I talked about when I said how they narrowed the definition down to human causes. But the sun is the major factor, and those are the ones I mentioned, Milankovitch. Those are what we call physical changes in the sun-Earth relationship. But then you've got changes in the sun itself, because of course, as you know, it's a hydrogen reactor, and so it cycles. You've got cycles within the sun. Sunspots are evidence of those cycles, and that causes changes in the electromagnetic radiation. For the longest time, the Chinese have known it for a couple of hundred years, that there was a relationship between the number of sunspots and the global temperature. More sunspots, warmer Earth, fewer sunspots, colder Earth. But the problem with that is, scientifically, that's a correlation, but it's not cause and effect. And one of the things that people need to understand, and I spent hours on this with my students, was just because you get correlations between numbers, you can't assume that one's causing the other. And my favorite one, and the public understand this, and I know that because my students understood it, I said to them, look, Diet Coke causes obesity. And my evidence is that more obese people drink Diet Coke than any other group. Therefore, it must be the Diet Coke that's causing the obesity. That's the danger of science. And so if you say, well, I've got sunspot numbers changing and the temperature's changing, until I know what the mechanism is, I can't make that scientific connection. Well, starting in 1991, in Sweden, they started to plot the sunspot numbers against cosmic radiation from deep space. And by the year 2000, Svensmark had shown that as the sunspots reflect a change in the sun, which is also reflected in a change of the strength of the sun's magnetic field. As the strength of the sun's magnetic field varies, it determines how much cosmic radiation reaches the Earth from space. Now, one of the things that we've known for a long time is there are not enough particles in the atmosphere to create the amount of cloud that we see. And the particles are called condensation nuclei. Well, now we know that those cosmic radiations from space, when they reach the lower atmosphere, they cause cloud. So what's happening is that as the sunspot numbers vary, the sun's magnetic field is varying. That's determining the amount of lower cloud that's being formed on Earth. And of course, the cloud cover, just like a screen in a greenhouse, is going to affect the global temperature. And this was, as I said, Svensmark came out with this in 2000. So what's interesting about this is it's been in the literature. It's now proven. And by the way, to show you how much political interference was, they needed to prove that these cosmic rays could actually create these condensation nuclei. They went to the CERN reactor in Geneva, and they did the experiments, and it showed that Svensmark was right. But the head of the CERN reactor refused to release the data because it contradicted what the official position was on climate change. And the IPCC still don't include that relationship between the sun's magnetic field and the cloud cover, and yet it's huge. So that's another part of the solar reaction or relationship. And so if you take the Svensmark tilt orbit and the changes in the sun through electromagnetic radiation, that explains about 98% of the temperature variation over time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And according to Milankovitch cyclicity, we know about 12,000 years cycles. And there are a lot of investigations which observed a significant cataclysm 12,000 years ago. Did you hear about it? And if so, what should we do now? If we live when some cycle changes, we have some geophysics changes, and we see that climate is changing. And what should we do?
First thing you need to do is start including all of the variables in your formulas and in your computer models. But the other thing that you've got to understand is you've got the cycles, and one of the challenges is to sort out which are the dominant ones, which are the ones that, because there are so many cycles that creates the net temperature that you end up with. To separate out each individual cycle that's causing it, that's the first thing that you need to do. But then you need to understand that the cycles are going on all the time, but every once in a while you get a catastrophic event, like the one 12,000 years ago, like the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. And of course that throws the whole thing off kilter for a while. So it's like when you throw a rock into the pond and it creates the ripples, but eventually that levels out and you go back to the major dominant controlling factors. So you need to understand first what all the cycles are, and this is the problem. They've spent so much time and so much money on theory rather than collecting data. We don't have the data. That's why I got into what I got into. I learned from Professor Lamb that until we can reconstruct accurately, with some degree of accuracy, the climate of the past, we're never going to sort out what the cycles are and what the mechanisms are that are driving them to improve our forecasting. Because the whole point of science is the ability to predict, to be able to predict and predict accurately. And the fact that the IPCC, for example, every prediction they've made since 1990 has been wrong, and yet they're still out there telling the world, oh, this is what's going on, you got to listen to us. Well, sorry, but your predictions are wrong. That means your science is wrong. End of story. But to your point, yes, we need to determine the cycles, and we also need to understand what the impact of catastrophic events are on the whole Earth system.
What's your take on the recent North Pole movement, speed of movement? Do you think it's going to stop in Siberia? You think it's going to go over? You think it's going to be a polarity reversal? What's going to happen?
The polarity reversals are quite regular through the whole geologic record. And the Earth's magnetic field has been weakening for about 1,000 years now. And if you project it forward in this simple trend, 120 years from now, we'll have no magnetic field. But we don't know what the specific impacts are when you have an Earth with no magnetic field. I mean, clearly you're going to have radiation from the sun, particularly, and from space that can penetrate to the ground. The geologic evidence is that you get large extinction of species when reversals occur. We don't know what's causing those reversals, and we don't know how long it takes for a reversal to occur. Initially, it was thought that the reversals are that the Earth's magnetic field is created by the rotation of the Earth. But if you're going to have a reversal, then that means that the Earth is going to stop rotating in one direction and start rotating in the other. And there's no evidence for that at all. The latest thinking is that the Earth is in 3 spheres, one within the other. Each is rotating at a different speed, and that induces a magnetic field. And as one cancels the other out, passes the other, then you get a new magnetic field created. We do know that in these extinction events, when there's no magnetic field protection, DNA is affected by the ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Mm-hmm. And as you know, so as I said, we really don't know what the impact of this is going to be, and how soon it will happen. As I said, if the current trend of weakening magnetic field goes on, it's 120 years that we'll reach zero Gaussian strength. What's the world plan to do about that? I don't know. Maybe we go down to the equator and run fast in one direction and speed up the rotation. But you see, this is part of the problem. We know, well, just to give you an example, they talk about extinction of species. We've only found and named about 35% of all the species that are on the planet. Every single week we discover far more species that we never knew existed before. And it just happened recently in Southeast Asia. And yet, virtually no species are going extinct. But think about the climate issue. What we're talking about is the sun and the atmosphere, but there are many other factors involved. How does the gravity of the Earth affect the global temperature? And we know that, for example, when the moon interferes with the Earth's gravitational field, that causes changes in the climate. And so one of the things that we've got, and Einstein did this, he gave up on his whole he looked for a unified field theory. That is, what is magnetism, gravity, and electricity? How are those three things interacting in this whole Earth system and the atmosphere? And the answer is we simply don't know. And so this idea that we know what's going on in the world and we can make predictions is totally false. And what we need to do is stop and settle down and say, okay, and that was part of the problem with the Cold War, when you got, because what I told you about earlier, where the East was one view of it, the West was the other view of it. Well, the media and the public were led to believe, well, this is part of the Cold War. No, it wasn't. It was a genuine scientific debate that never got enjoined. And we're at the point where we can't afford politics anymore. It's killing us. And what we need to do is to allow scientists to pursue all of these questions. And unfortunately, what I watched in the university, in the West at least, was it went from publish or perish. And then, of course, if you publish the right things with the right journals, you got promoted. And it went from that to bring in research funds or perish. Funding became the total dominant control of what research was done and what got funded. And that's why everybody rushed into, and just to show you how bizarre it was, I like to make fun of things to point out how ridiculous they are. I realized that Western governments were funding AIDS research and they were funding global warming. So I put in a request for research funds to study the cause of AIDS by global warming.
Okay.
Put the two together. But this is what's going on in science. It's so biased, it's so misdirected.
We predict that people began to remove from one place to another because of natural disasters, and and we understand that we have, as a society, do something with it. What can we do as a person to another person?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's one that I've been grappling with ever since I flew search and rescue. Because most of the searches I was on were for people that just did stupid things. And yet we had to go out and risk our lives to save these people. And at some point you start to say, well, okay, I'm my brother's keeper, which is of course the whole Christian ethic, but am I my stupid brother's keeper? And if you go and live on a volcano, don't be surprised if the volcano erupts. And then of course that's what they do. They go and live in places that they know are dangerous, and then, oh, you've got to bail me out, you've got to help me out. We dealt with that when I lived in Winnipeg. It's a floodplain. And we tried to designate areas and say, look, we actually put it on the building permit. Said, if you build a house in this area, you're going to get flooding, and it's your responsibility. But they built them there, and what happens? Oh, they get the media in, oh, we're flooding, we need help. And of course, the people come and help them. So we need to stop this perpetuating bad behavior, stupid behavior. And we need to start zoning the world in terms of the levels of danger. Every part of the world's got danger. There's nowhere that you don't have some natural threat or natural disaster. And so we need to start zoning it on that basis, and then determining what you're going to let people do. I mean, are you going to let people live in a dangerous area? You say, well, okay, fine. If you do, then sign this form to say that you accept all responsibility. But this is the problem that democracy is facing. I mean, this is the challenge that America's got. You say, well, yeah, you can do whatever you want. Well, okay, then you get into, oh, you've got to help me. Well, sorry that you're doing what you wanted. This is the challenge the whole world's confronting right now. But we really need to rethink it in terms of natural disasters and what danger people put themselves in.
Dr. Ball, may I ask you, because there's a lot of now discussions about Yellowstone supervolcano, and there's also IRA, and no one can predict when these volcanoes would erupt. And the activity of these volcanoes, for example, the Yellowstone, is getting higher. It can be that everyone will be affected by this event, but what should we do? I mean, what can we do? I'm not a scientist, but what can I do now to provide the right information? I mean, to spread the right information so that we can be innerly prepared to this.
What you can do is advise people. I mean, for example, I live on the west coast of Canada here, and it's an earthquake zone. But what I do is I live back from the coast because I know what level previous tsunamis have come in here. And so I think that what we do is that we, as I said, we start to zone the world in terms of the natural risks that are there, and then give that information to people, and then they can make up their own mind. Saying, oh, we're going to stop all disaster. I mean, think about the stupidity of that Greta Thunberg. She's going to stop climate change. Get serious. How are you going to stop climate change when one thunderstorm has more energy than 25 hydrogen bombs in it? And I remember when they were talking about the ozone hole, and somebody said, oh, well, why don't we create ozone at the ground level and pump it in and fill in the hole? And then did the calculations just back on the back of an envelope and said, you need all of the energy that humans produce and use in total to produce enough ozone to do that. It's just completely illogical. So, as I said, what we need to do is start with the recognition and acceptance that this is a very risky world, and it's more risky in some areas than others, and we need to designate those risk areas, and then say to people, okay, I'm not going to force you to carry insurance or to build a bomb shelter or whatever. But, if you're going to live in a hurricane area and you don't have a place that you can go when the hurricane's blowing, I'm sorry, you're not going to get much sympathy from me. So we really need to rethink this. And a lot of it, as I said, is because the insurance companies make so much money off of this. And by the way, go and look at the involvement of the insurance companies in Swiss Re, for example. After the Hurricane Andrew, the small insurance companies were not able to meet cover all the insurance they had out there, so these reinsurance companies formed. I went to Bermuda and visited 5 of them. And these are just licensed to print money. I mean, one place I went, they had 13 employees, and they had assets into the billions of dollars because people were paying for the insurance, and they hardly ever had to pay out. And so Swiss Re, for example, made movies about the dangers of global warming. And why are insurance companies saying, oh, here's a threat? Well, then you need more insurance. So, as I said, we need to calm down, we need to step back, we need to look at what's really going on here. And that's what I'm trying to do.
No lie lasts forever. Truth always triumphs. Now is the time for the truth. we will give you the facts of historical deception of all of humanity. In the year 1992, a 12-year-old environmental activist, Severin Suzuki,
I am fighting for my future. Losing my future is not like losing an election or a few points on the stock market. I am afraid to go out in the sun now because of the holes in our ozone. I am afraid to breathe the air.
the year 2018, a 16-year-old eco-activist, Greta Thunberg,
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams, my childhood, with your empty words. Lie on my generation, sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2.
Interesting, isn't it? An old song written by the Cooks of Lies has been played again after 27 years. So what is the reason for such ardent performances by young eco-activists? In 1989, the Montreal Protocol was signed. The major scarecrow for people was the ozone holes. This scam destroyed the world's refrigeration industry and allowed billions to be made on this swindle. The ozone holes did not disappear, but the pockets swelled with dollars. 97, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. The main problem is the infamous CO2. Greenhouse gases are now a new commodity. As the total climate finance average in 2019-2020 alone amounted to $632 billion US. A new global scam that is profitable for those cooks in the kitchen of lies. These subhumans exploit children, pleading for sympathy. Aren't you sick of it? To slurp down a stinky broth of lies and pay for it with your hard-earned money. The climate fight today is a big, cruel business. We are forced to toil away for food and shelter and to pay for air. The climate attacks and kills us mercilessly. It spares no one and takes no money. Cataclysms are escalating rapidly, and they are becoming stronger and more synchronized. Let's not be silent any longer. It's time for the truth. It is time to act. Let's bring the whole world together